This story does not find its beginning in the deafening thunder of heavy artillery or the rhythmic pounding of celebratory marches. Instead, it starts on a simple, dusty road where a fresh column of reinforcements arrived at the unit's location. Among the sea of ordinary, tired faces of soldiers worn down by endless transfers, one particular figure stood out so starkly that even the most talkative jokers suddenly fell silent. This was not merely a man, but a literal monument of nature itself. Immense, broad-shouldered, and towering, he seemed like a character stepped out of ancient heroic legends, accidentally misplaced into the harsh realities of the 20th century. Semyon Filipovich Antipkin, a man weighing a staggering 150 kilograms and standing nearly 2 meters tall, entered the daily routine of military life slowly and deliberately, as if every single step he took was being etched permanently into the annals of history. During those first few days of his arrival, almost no one in the unit perceived this giant as a formidable combat asset. On the contrary, his massive proportions evoked more ironic curiosity than respect, and at times even overt snickering. The soldiers, a folk always sharp of tongue, quickly found in this good-natured titan a perfect target for their exercises in wit. They mockingly referred to him as our collective umbrella, joked that an entire dedicated supply train would be required just to keep him fed, and speculated endlessly on how many bolts of fabric had been sacrificed to stitch together his massive tunic. Some of the bolder souls, whose bravery occasionally bordered on pure recklessness, were not even afraid to tease him to his face, knowing full well his incredibly calm and non-confrontational disposition. Semyon would simply offer a quiet smile in response, sometimes rewarding a particularly annoying jokester with a friendly pat on the back. Yet even such a light manifestation of affection often caused the recipient to momentarily lose their sense of balance, feeling the full, crushing weight of a palm that seemed to weigh several pounds on its own. However, all the mockery and biased attitudes evaporated in a single transformative moment, a moment that forever divided the life of the unit into a distinct before and after. It happened during a sudden aerial raid, when the sky was pierced by the unmistakable and terrifying shriek of a German dive bomber. The Junkers U-87, nicknamed the Stuka or Clodhopper by the troops, was diving toward its target, radiating a chilling confidence in its own impunity. At that precise second, while the rest of the soldiers instinctively pressed themselves into the dirt, seeking any kind of salvation in the folds of the terrain, Antipkin acted differently. He calmly, without any trace of frantic haste, reached for his heavy anti-tank rifle. For any other man, this weapon was a cumbersome, agonizing burden that required the synchronized labor of 2 strong soldiers, but in Semyon's hands, it looked as natural and effortless as a teenager holding a light wooden target rifle. He did not bother to take a standard firing position, nor did he search for a support or a tripod. He simply hoisted the massive anti-tank rifle to his shoulder, freezing in place like a stone statue. In that brief microsecond when the bomber entered his sights, time seemed to decelerate into slow motion. A thunderous roar tore through the air, and a second later, the enemy machine, having sustained a critical hit to its most vulnerable mechanical node, transformed into a screaming ball of fire that crashed not far from their positions. This was not just a lucky hit, it was a total demolition of every existing stereotype regarding the limits of infantry weaponry and human physical strength. That evening, a heavy, contemplative silence hung over the trenches. The soldiers looked at Semyon with a new, not yet fully realized sense of awe. As for the enemy, as was later learned from radio intercepts and prisoner interrogations, word quickly spread about the Soviet colossus who could knock planes out of the sky single-handedly. For them, he became a living nightmare, a symbol of an invincible force that could not be calculated or confined within the rigid frameworks of military manuals. But to understand the profound inner strength that stood behind this external might, one must return to his very origins. Semyon was born in the year 1905 in the Penza province, in a tiny, nondescript village with the poetic name of Vezemka. These were lands where the soil demanded deep respect and back-breaking labor, and it was precisely there that his unique physiology began to take its shape. From his earliest years, Semyon's parents noticed that their son was developing according to some mysterious, special blueprint of his own. Where his peers took one step, he took two. Where others struggled to lift a single bucket of water, young Semyon was already moving heavy logs by the age of 10. His appetite became a legend of local proportions. The boy ate enough for 3 grown men, but this was never a waste of food. Every calorie was converted into dense muscle mass and bones as solid as tempered iron. As he grew older, the physical gap between him and ordinary people only widened further. By the time he reached adulthood, Semyon had finally matured into that very titan we later saw at the front. His entire pre-war life was a sequence of exhausting but honest toil. He worked in places where machinery failed or where a concentration of incredible physical energy was required. This experience taught him a fundamental truth. Any task, no matter how difficult, had to be completed regardless of the cost. When the war broke out, Antipkin was 36 years old, the age of absolute physical and psychological peak. He went to the front not just as a draftee, but as a man fully conscious of his responsibility to the land that had nurtured him. However, the military system, built on averages and standard metrics, proved completely unprepared for an individual of his scale. The very first attempt to process him and provide him with gear turned into a complex logistical operation. The quartermasters clutched their heads in genuine horror while looking at his frame. Standard tunics literally burst at the seams across his chest, and trousers barely reached down to his knees. The boots were a particularly painful headache. Size 47, which Semyon required, was a massive rarity, and on the front lines it was virtually impossible to find. For a long time he was forced to literally squeeze his feet into footwear that was 2 or 3 sizes too small. It is hard to even imagine the sheer willpower required not just to walk, but to engage in active combat when every single step causes sharp, agonizing pain due to compressed feet. But Semyon endured it all, considering it merely a temporary and insignificant inconvenience. Later, when the right boots were finally procured, he felt as if he had grown wings, though the flight of such a giant still caused the earth to tremble beneath the feet of his comrades. Even the most basic domestic aspects of war turned into a trial for him. A horse would literally buckle under his weight, so the cavalry was effectively closed to him. Standard trenches designed for a man of average height could not conceal his massive silhouette. Semyon was forced to dig his own shelters much deeper, sometimes descending 1.5 meters into the ground so that his head would not tower above the parapet. While his comrades could move through the communication trenches by merely crouching slightly, Antipkin had to crawl almost on all fours or move in a deep squat, which, given his weight, demanded a colossal expenditure of energy. Yet all these hardships were merely the background for his true purpose in this war. His weight and height, which seemed like a curse in daily life, became his primary advantage in the heat of battle. It was his unique physics that allowed him to master the anti-tank rifle in a way no one else could. A standard anti-tank rifle crew consisted of a gunner and an assistant, because carrying the weapon itself, along with the heavy ammunition and accessories, was an impossible task for one man on the march. Semyon ignored these rules, not out of pride, but out of practicality. He realized that his strength gave him unprecedented mobility. He could change positions faster than any 2-man crew, acting covertly and lightning fast, becoming an invisible and lethal ghost for enemy tanks. When we speak of the Degtyarev anti-tank rifle, we imagine a long, nearly 2-meter barrel that weighs over 20 kilograms. Under normal conditions, this weapon was a grueling test for 2 soldiers. One carried the pipe itself, while the other lugged heavy bags filled with 14.5 millimeter caliber cartridges. But for Semyon Antipkin, this rifle became an extension of his own body. His massive hands gripped the handle and forend so tightly that the violent vibration of the shot, which could easily dislocate the shoulder of an average person, was absorbed by his powerful muscular frame. It was here, on the front lines, that his transformation began, from a simple volunteer into a unique lone hunter whose efficiency surpassed that of entire squads. His path led through the fiery inferno of Stalingrad. The city on the Volga during that period was a nightmare labyrinth of broken bricks, mangled iron, and gray dust that choked the lungs. It would seem that for a man of Semyon's dimensions, urban combat should have been a death trap. After all, the larger you are, the easier it is to spot you in a broken window frame or behind a pile of rubble. However, Antipkin displayed surprising intuition and tactical flexibility. He learned to use his strength to occupy positions that were considered completely inaccessible to ordinary armor-piercing gunners. He could, alone and without waiting for help, drag his heavy equipment to the upper floors of half-ruined buildings, navigating through debris that required immense physical power to clear. Semyon's hunting in Stalingrad was methodical and chillingly calm. He understood that German tanks in the narrow city streets were enormous but vulnerable beasts. Their armor on the sides and top was much thinner than on the front, and Semyon utilized this fact masterfully. He chose ambush points where the enemy tank appeared as if on the palm of a hand. His comrades remembered how he could remain motionless for hours, despite the fact that his massive body would go numb in cramped hiding spots. But when the moment came, he acted with lightning speed. One precise shot into the engine compartment or near the fuel tank, and the steel monster would freeze, engulfed in thick black smoke. One of the most striking traits of Antipkin was his ability to operate without a second number. According to the manual, an assistant gunner was supposed to feed ammunition and help with aiming, but Semyon handled it all himself. His huge fingers moved with surprising dexterity, managing the massive cartridges and chambering them with the mechanical precision of a clock. This gave him an incredible advantage in mobility. While German tank crews were still trying to calculate where the first round had come from, Semyon would have already grabbed his rifle and, making a dash through the ruins, repositioned himself at a new vantage point. His movements across the battlefield resembled the shift of a natural disaster, powerful, inevitable, and completely unpredictable.
Rumors of a Soviet giant with a cannon spread rapidly among the enemy. German reports began to mention some kind of super powerful weapon that the Russians were employing in the city's ruins. They simply could not believe that all this destruction was the work of a single man. The psychological effect was colossal. German crews, who until recently felt like masters of the situation inside their armored boxes, began to experience a paralyzing fear. They knew, somewhere out there, in the shadow of scorched walls, someone was watching them, someone for whom their armor was merely a temporary obstacle. But Semyon Filipovich did not just fight against machinery. His rifle became the scourge of enemy machine gun nests. In the conditions of urban warfare, suppressing a machine gun nestled in a concrete bunker or behind the thick walls of a basement was a task of exceptional difficulty. Ordinary rifles couldn't touch them, and calling in artillery was not always an option. And so they would call for Antipkin. He would creep up to point-blank range and, with his heavy caliber, literally tear out the enemy's firing points along with their crews. For him, it was grueling, exhausting work, which he performed with his characteristic calm, knowing that every silenced machine gun meant lives saved for his comrades moving into the assault. Interestingly, despite all his terrifying power, Semyon maintained a surprising level of humanity. In the brief moments of quiet, he transformed back into that same good-natured giant from Vizemka. He would share his last piece of bread, help the wounded, and literally carry them out of the line of fire in his arms. His broad back literally became a shield for many young soldiers. Those who yesterday were mocking his size now looked at him with adoration and a firm belief that as long as Semyon was nearby, no force could break them.
However, the war continued to demand the impossible from him. The Stalingrad epic was drawing to a close, and ahead lay the Kursk Bulge, a place where the concentration of steel and fire was set to reach its historical maximum. It was there that Antipkin would face brand new challenges. The German command was preparing to launch its latest developments, tanks with even thicker armor and more powerful guns. The Tigers and Panthers were meant to be the answer to Soviet resistance, but they did not yet know that in their path stood a man who had already learned to win not just with the strength of metal, but with the strength of his spirit. During this period, Semyon began to refine his shooting technique even further. He realized that against the newer tanks, a standard hit might not be enough. He began studying the vulnerable spots of the machines using technical manuals and accounts from mechanics. He was interested in vision slits, the joints between the turret and the hull, the rollers and the tracks. He trained his eye to estimate the distance to a target with the accuracy of a single meter. His preparation began to resemble that of an elite sniper, with the only difference being that in his hands was not a light rifle, but a booming ordnance capable of piercing inches of hardened steel. Every day for Semyon Antipkin was filled with the act of overcoming the pain of tight boots, overcoming the fatigue from constant heavy lifting, and overcoming the fear of a superior enemy. But his character, forged in heavy peasant labor, showed no cracks. He moved forward, leaving behind graveyards of scorched German machinery and legends that began to live a life of their own. His figure became a symbol of the fact that a soldier is capable of adapting to any conditions and turning even his perceived flaws into a crushing weapon of victory. By the summer of 1943, Antipkin's name was already firmly etched into award lists and military reports, but ahead lay an ordeal whose scale was difficult to imagine even for seasoned veterans. The Kursk Bulge became that very place where not just two armies collided, but two polar ideas of warfare. On one side was German engineering, precise to the millimeter, with new steel monsters designed to reclaim the initiative for the Wehrmacht. On the other was the incredible resilience and ingenuity of the Soviet soldier. It was here, in the endless steppes drenched in scorching sun and shrouded in the smoke of fires, that Semyon Filipovich showed what a man can do when his will to win is as great as his stature. At Kursk, the tactics of urban combat shifted to a positional confrontation in vast open spaces. For Antipkin, this meant a new set of difficulties. Concealing such a giant in an open field was practically impossible. Any small hill seemed insufficient, any crater too narrow. But Semyon transformed that very space into his own playground. He learned to use the slightest irregularities of the terrain and camouflaged his position so skillfully that German tankers only noticed his presence when a heavy gift slammed into the side of their machine. His massive hands now operated the anti-tank rifle with even more confidence, and his eye was so well trained that he could determine the range with minimal error, accounting even for crosswinds and the heat haze rising from the scorched earth. The most famous episode of this period was his duel with a German Tiger. This tank was the absolute crown of German engineering at the time, massive armor and a powerful gun capable of hitting targets at great distances. It was widely believed that an anti-tank rifle was virtually powerless against the frontal armor of such a beast, but Antipkin had no intention of hitting it head-on. He waited until the steel Titan began to maneuver, exposing its less protected side. At the moment the Tiger clattered its tracks, turning for another shot, Semyon pulled the trigger. The first shot snapped the track, robbing the machine of its mobility. The tank froze, turning into a stationary target, but it still spat fire. With his second and third shots, Antipkin methodically, with surgical precision, struck the vision slits and jammed the turret. This case became a visual lesson for other soldiers. Even the most terrifying opponent is vulnerable if faced by a professional with a cold heart and a steady hand. All his feats at Kursk were not just campfire stories. Every knocked-out tank and every suppressed firing point were recorded by the command and confirmed by eyewitness accounts. In just over 2 years of active service, he was officially credited with 8 destroyed tanks. For an anti-tank gunner working with a rifle, this was an astronomical figure. But behind these dry numbers lay daily, grueling work. Semyon Filipovich literally lived for his weapon. He cleaned it with the same meticulous care a mother shows for a child, knowing that in the decisive moment the mechanism must not fail. In those days, Antipkin had to display not only physical strength, but also extraordinary cleverness. German snipers began hunting him specifically, realizing that this giant with a gun was inflicting damage on their equipment that was vastly disproportionate to the resources used against him. Semyon often created decoy positions. He set up dummies mimicking the barrel of an anti-tank rifle, forcing the enemy to waste ammunition, and revealed their positions, while he himself was located a couple of 100 meters away, waiting for a favorable opportunity. His patience was truly infinite. He could lie in an uncomfortable position for hours, ignoring thirst, insects, and the blistering heat until the target was in the guaranteed kill zone. In addition to armored vehicles, his personal list of victories was populated by enemy personnel, though Semyon himself never sought to accumulate these grim tallies. He noted only those cases that had tactical significance. For example, the destruction of machine gun crews in bunkers. There were moments when an entire company could not rise to the attack because of a single well-placed German machine gun. Then Antipkin would step in. His heavy caliber allowed him to pierce embrasures and concrete fortifications, silencing the enemy forever. In total, he neutralized more than 100 such threats, effectively clearing the path for his comrades and saving countless lives.
Remarkably, despite all his effectiveness, Semyon remained a man of extraordinary modesty. When he was recommended for further awards, he would simply shrug his broad shoulders and say that he was just doing what every man ought to do when trouble comes to his land. His strength did not make him arrogant. On the contrary, he seemed to feel an even greater responsibility toward those who were physically weaker than him. In the intervals between battles, he often helped the medics, carrying the wounded in his own arms through difficult terrain where carts could not pass. For many young soldiers, he became a true father figure, a symbol of the fact that justice and power always go hand in hand. However, war is not just about triumphant salvos and heroic reports. Gradually, the colossal strain began to take a toll even on his Herculean health. The constant vibrations from the powerful weapon, the life in damp trenches that were never a proper fit, and the chronic lack of food, since his enormous body required far more than the standard ration, started to sap his strength. But Semyon showed no sign of it. He continued to go on the hunt, continued to lug his faithful rifle, becoming increasingly somber and focused. In his eyes, all the pain of the journey was reflected, but his determination did not flicker for a moment. By the middle of 1944, the situation on the fronts began to change rapidly in favor of the Soviet army. Our troops were advancing westward, liberating one settlement after another. But along with the joy of victories came the realization that every step forward required new sacrifices. Antipkin, being at the cutting edge of the attacks as a tank-killing specialist, was constantly under fire. In one of these battles, the luck that had protected this amazing man for so long momentarily turned away from him. The next fight, which became fateful for Semyon's continued service, changed his life forever, but it did not break his spirit. The events of 1944 became a moment of truth for Semyon Filipovich, a time when fate itself decided that his mission on the front line was complete. In one of the fierce clashes, while Soviet troops were breaching the enemy's deep echelon defenses, the metal of war finally found its mark. The wound proved to be extremely serious, the kind that permanently alters the familiar rhythm of life. For a person of average build, such an injury might have been fatal, but Antipkin's phenomenal organism, accustomed to extreme loads and possessing an incredible reserve of durability, entered the fight for life. His strong heart and powerful immune system accomplished the nearly impossible. After long months in hospitals, where doctors watched the recovery process of this titan in amazement, the wounds began to heal.
However, the medical commission's verdict was final. Returning to the active army and the harsh conditions of trench life was out of the question. In that same year of 1944, Semyon Filipovich was discharged. Returning home to his native lands was a journey filled with mixed emotions. On one hand, a desire burned in his soul to reach the heart of the enemy's lair alongside his comrades. On the other, the time for peaceful labor had arrived. His return to the Penza province was a true event for his fellow villagers. People came out to meet their hero, who over the years of the war had become a living legend. He returned the same way he had left, modest, soft-spoken, with that same kind smile, but in his eyes now lay the wisdom of a man who had seen the raw underside of the world. Peaceful life required no less courage and industriousness than the front. Semyon Filipovich did not know how to, and did not want to, sit idly by. Despite the trials he had endured and the consequences of his severe injury, he threw himself back into work. His massive hands, which only yesterday had gripped the scorched barrel of an anti-tank rifle, now handled the tools of peace. He worked with the same dedication with which he had hunted enemy tigers, understanding that the reconstruction of the country was just as vital a front. Those around him were astonished by his endurance. It seemed as if the years and wounds held no power over this man. He never boasted about his medals and rarely spoke of those terrible days, preferring to talk about the future, about children, and about how important it is to protect the peace that was bought at such a high price. The long and dignified life of Semyon Filipovich continued for 3 decades after the end of the great upheaval. He became a living bridge between a heroic past and a future under construction. For the youth, he was an example that true strength lies not only in the volume of muscles, but in the purity of intent. His story about the downed Junkers grew with time with legendary details, but he himself always modestly clarified the facts, emphasizing that at that moment he was driven not by a desire for fame, but by the necessity to protect his friends. That episode with the plane became a symbol of how a non-standard approach and personal courage can overcome any technical superiority of the enemy. In 1974, the earthly journey of this remarkable man reached its logical conclusion. His passing was quiet and peaceful, worthy of a warrior who had fulfilled his duty to the very end. Semyon Filipovich was gone, but the memory of him proved stronger than time. The stories of the Penza giant who single-handedly operated a heavy weapon and made enemy tank crews tremble were passed down from father to son. His life became undeniable proof that the human character is capable of incredible transformations, from a good-natured village laborer to a fearsome guardian of the skies and the earth.
Today, when we look back and analyze the path of Semyon Antipkin, we see more than just statistics of destroyed tanks or downed aircraft. And 2-meter height were not just physical parameters, but a tool that nature had gifted him to perform great deeds. All his achievements were carefully documented so that future generations would know this is not a myth, not a figment of a writer's imagination, but the real story of a real man who lived among us, walked the same earth, and loved his homeland just as much. It is important to remember that behind every line in a history textbook stand the destinies of people like Semyon Filipovich. Their feats are the foundation upon which our memory and our pride rest. Preserving this memory is our collective task, for as long as we remember the man who could stop a steel armada with a single precise shot, his spirit continues to live among us, inspiring new achievements and reminding us that for a true will, nothing is impossible. His life teaches us that even in the darkest of times, when the enemy seems invincible, a single person with a firm character and a clear goal can change everything. I hope that this detailed account of the fate of Semyon Filipovich Antipkin has helped you look at the history of that time in a new way and appreciate the immense scale of this unique warrior's personality. His example is an eternal reminder that heroes live among us, and they often hide behind the mask of the most ordinary-looking people. May the memory of him be long, and may his story continue to inspire everyone who strives for light and truth.